A long-awaited report this week set out proposals to help leaseholders who want to buy their freehold or, indeed, extend their lease. At the moment, they must pay a premium to buy out the rights which the freeholder owns. The way that's calculated is very complicated and can lead to massive payments to the freeholder. The government asked the Law Commission for ways to make things simpler and cheaper for leaseholders. The Law Commission is there to propose changes to simplify the law. The BBC's Howard Mustoe went to meet Des Kinsella at his flat in Ilford, East London.
Howard,
Des, hi. Howard
Great
from the
to meet
BBC.
you.
Good to meet you. How are you doing?
Great, thank you. This way there.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. What was your plan in buying this place?
The plan was to get my son on a property ladder because looking at auctions thought we might get something slightly cheaper, and we did notice that the lease was quite short, but we saw it was viable because we accounted for the amount which we believed was going to be about 20k.
Des Kinsella paid £165,000 for the flat, which had 65 years left on the lease. He wants to add 90 years. What did the freeholder come back and say? What did they want?
The freeholder's counter offer was roughly 42,000.
That's double what he thought he would pay, and he's not alone in being asked to foot a big bill. The BBC put in Freedom of Information requests to English and Welsh councils asking about extensions on leasehold flats bought under right to buy. Already, councils have extended more than 2,500 leases, raising more than £27 million. Of the most expensive, a lease in Camden with 38 years left raised £209,000 for its council. Large parts of these payments, and for shorter leases, the majority, are for marriage value. So in this process, you're making three payments because it's a shorter lease, it's less than 80 years. You've got to make three payments. You've got to pay off the ground rent that you owe. You've got to pay for the actual years, the extra 90 years. And then there's a third payment called marriage value. What did you think when you were told about this marriage value payment?
I didn't understand it, but I didn't really see why it was required to be put in there. A fee should be a fee. It doesn't come up when you do the online calculations. It doesn't come up there's a marriage value.
Let's recap what marriage value is. The government's advisory service for leaseholders describes it as the increase in value of the property once the lease has been extended. Some of that is down to a 150-year lease being worth more than a 60-year one, of course. But any gain above that, or profit, as the Leasehold Advisory Service calls it, is then shared between the freeholder and the leaseholder, and the leaseholder has to hand over the freeholder's half. Beyond 80 years, according to the law, the value is zero. The Law Commission has come up with three options: abolish marriage value, pay a reduced fee called hope value, or leave things more or less the same. What did you make of what they said?
I thought it was going to be making things fairer and cheaper for leaseholders, so possibly would have worked out in our favour, as with many other people, But I'm not sure which one is going to be, and if it's the option number 3, which is basically keep it at the same. So the government could choose to take that one, and then we're just all back at square one. So all this has been for nothing, really.
What's this mean for those on the other side of the deal, the freeholders? Katie Cohen, a partner at Keystone Law, works for both freeholders and leaseholders.
Freeholders can take that the law is absolutely going to change in some respects. The extent to which it is going to change is obviously still very much up in the air. What we also have to understand is that the terms of reference is to reduce premiums.
What's the most likely outcome, do you think?
This is obviously my own personal view. I believe that the status quo will remain with some tweaks. I don't think that the government will have any appetite, for example, to abolish marriage value in its entirety. And what you also have to appreciate is that the interests of the leaseholder and the freeholder are diametrically opposed. The freeholder wants the leaseholder to pay as much as possible, and the leaseholder wants to pay as less as possible.
Louis Burns says the report is a big disappointment. He's managing director of Leasehold Solutions Group and a campaigner on behalf of leaseholders.
leaseholders and us, we all were hoping that this would be more radical. The Law Commission were tasked to make this easier and simpler for leaseholders and cheaper. It's a complex document that most leaseholders aren't really going to understand. And I'm not sure the government are going to understand it either. The big worry for us is who is going to make the decision of what is fair, what should be chosen, and what the details of this will be later on.
What do you hope MPs and the government will do?
I hope that they consign leasehold to the history books. This is a feudal land tenure that's been in existence from 1066. It has no place in our property market in the 21st century, and we have a real chance here to make this system fairer for leaseholders, simpler, and get away from the inequities that have just plagued this system for centuries.
Louis Burns talking to Howard Mustoe. Well, let's go live now to talk to Professor Nick Hopkins. He's the Law Commissioner responsible for this report. Nick Hopkins, an opportunity to get rid of a feudal system. Why didn't you take it?
But what we've been asked to do in this report is provide government with options to reduce the price that leaseholders pay when they extend their lease or buy their freehold as part of the existing leasehold system. And so we have provided government with a suite of options, the outcome of which would be much simpler and clearer law for leaseholders and also cheaper prices.
Well, there are three options, three schemes. One of them comes out at exactly the same price, option 3, doesn't it? Why did you leave that in? Because you were asked to reduce the price.
And what we say about that scheme is that it could be combined with other options that we put forward so that the price overall is in fact reduced. So, for example, in addition to those schemes, we suggest that the rates used to calculate the price, which are the source of considerable disputes, could be prescribed so that there's no argument over those rates.
So set down in law, you mean, rather than argued about by lawyers on both sides?
Yes, absolutely. So that rather than being argued about in individual cases where we know the odds are stacked against leaseholders, those rates are simply set down in law.
But looking at the three things that make up this premium, there's the ground rent. I mean, it's perfectly understandable to people, I think, that if the freehold owner gives up ground rent for 40 or 50 years, they should have some compensation for that. That's straightforward. But then there's this question of how much more this property is worth to the freeholder, to the leaseholder, once they become a freeholder or extend the lease. That's a complex calculation and adds about £7,000 on the example you give to it. And then there's this thing called the marriage value. Now, one of your proposals gets rid of the marriage value. We won't go into how that works or what it's for, but it's complicated and it costs £7,000 in your example. But why have this reversion there, this £7,500 just because the property is worth more? Why not just go for the simplest, which you don't even propose, of just giving them compensation for ground rent and then the property is yours?
And a lot of leaseholders who contacted us were very clear that what they wanted was a very simple formula based on paying ground rent for a period of time. But we have to provide options for government that are consistent with British human rights law. And the advice we've had is that simply compensating the landlord for the ground rent is not compatible with British human rights law.
But hang on, human rights law, what's that got to do with it? I mean, it's not there to protect the rights of multi-millionaire landowners, is it? It's to protect the rights of ordinary people.
Well, it is irrefutable in the law at the moment that the result of the leasehold system is that the landlord has a financially valuable asset, financially valuable asset. And when a leaseholder is extending the lease or buying the freehold, they are buying that asset from the landlord, regardless of whether that landlord is an individual, a company, an offshore company, or a pension fund.
But do pension funds and offshore companies have human rights?
They do indeed, and that is clearly established by law, that those human rights are the same whoever the landlord is.
I think people are going to find this absolutely extraordinary that they have human rights. And let me just, because we are towards the end of the programme, let me just ask you this. 27 of your past reports are still pending, the oldest from 2006. You've got 3 more papers on leasehold later this year. It could be years before there's any actual change, couldn't it?
Well, we certainly hope that isn't the case. Historically, around 2/3 of our reports have been implemented in whole or in part. The government has put considerable resources into us doing this work. So once we publish our remaining reports in spring, we hope we will then be moving towards preparing legislation.
Nick Hopkins, thank you very much. Well, our lease on this studio is about to end. I never thought of paying to extend it. Perhaps we should think about that. Anyway, we're going back to the office to read all your emails at moneybox@bbc.co.uk, tweets at Moneybox. More on Moneybox Live on Wednesday. How can young people buy their first home without borrowing from their parents? Moneybox@bbc.co.uk. Felicity Hannah and her guests will respond. Today, reporter Howard Mustoe, producer Alex Lewis. I'm Paul Lewis.